He was the most feared man in New York, a shadow emperor who could end careers with a whisper and lives with a nod. But Marco De Luca, the capo dei capi who commanded an empire built on vision and intimidation, couldn't see what was right in front of him. For 6 years, his twin sons had lived in darkness, moving like ghosts through the marble halls of his fortress. The best ophthalmologists in Switzerland had delivered the same verdict: complete, irreversible blindness. But then came a Thursday evening at Il Destino, his family's flagship restaurant, and a waitress named Elena Vance, who should have known better than to interrupt a boss mid-rage. She didn't bring him apologies or excuses. She leaned down to those broken boys and whispered 4 words that would shatter everything Marco thought he knew about power, weakness, and legacy. What happened next didn't just silence the dining room. It turned the King of Shadows' greatest shame into his most dangerous weapon, and pulled a brilliant, haunted woman into a world where one mistake could be her last. The thunderstorm hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Il Destino, New York's most exclusive Italian establishment, turning the glittering cityscape into rivers of amber and shadow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of saffron risotto, aged leather, and the particular tension that came when predators dined among prey. Elena Vance adjusted her black vest, her fingers trembling slightly as she tucked a loose strand of blonde hair back into her tight bun. She'd been working at Il Destino for exactly 4 weeks, just long enough to recognize the signs. When the maître d', Salvatore Russo, started tugging at his collar and his voice dropped to that specific octave of controlled panic, it meant the boss was coming. Vance. Salvatore materialized beside her near the kitchen pass, his grip on her elbow just shy of painful. Table 1. You're up. Elena's breath caught. Table 1 wasn't just a table. It was a throne. It sat in the northeast corner beneath the Murano chandelier, permanently reserved for Marco De Luca, the man the tabloids called Capo dei Capi, the apex predator of New York's underworld. She'd heard the stories. A restaurant owner who served him overcooked veal had his lease mysteriously terminated the next day. The establishment burned down a week later. "I thought Gianni was covering table 1, Elena said, glancing toward the senior server who was suddenly very interested in polishing wine glasses in the far corner of the room. "Gianni called in sick." Salvatore dabbed his forehead with a pocket square. "You're all I've got. Pour the water. Take the order. Do not, and I mean this, Elena, do not stare at him. And whatever you do, ignore the boys." Elena frowned. "The boys? His sons. Twins. He brings them sometimes." Salvatore's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They're damaged. Just stay away from them. Don't engage. Don't even look directly at them. Capisce?" Before Elena could ask what he meant by damaged, the heavy bronze doors at the entrance swung open with theatrical weight. The effect was instantaneous. The restaurant, usually a symphony of clinking crystal, murmured negotiations, and artificial laughter, went silent. Not quiet. Silent, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire world. Marco De Luca entered. He was exactly as the photograph suggested, yet somehow more, well over 6 feet, his frame draped in a midnight black suit that looked like it had been tailored by Italian artisans who understood that clothing was armor. His face was all brutal geometry, sharp jaw, pronounced cheekbones, a nose that had been broken and reset with surgical precision. But it was his neck that drew the eye. Intricate tattoos crawled up from his collar like vines of violence, disappearing into his slicked-back hair. His eyes, dark as pitch, swept the room with the casual assessment of a predator cataloguing prey. 2 bodyguards flanked him, broad-shouldered mountains in expensive suits whose jackets couldn't quite hide the bulges at their ribs. But Elena's attention snagged on the small figures trailing behind Marco's purposeful stride. Twin boys, no older than 6, dressed in miniature versions of their father's suit, grey vests over crisp white shirts, tiny dress shoes that clicked against the marble floor. They were beautiful children, with the same dark hair as their father, the same sharp features softened by youth. But something was wrong. Their eyes, striking, pale blue against their olive skin, didn't track the room. They didn't glance at the other diners or the ornate decor. Instead, both boys moved with their hands extended slightly forward, fingers splayed as if feeling for invisible walls. One twin had his head cocked at an odd angle, mouth slightly open. The other flinched violently when a waiter dropped a menu 3 tables away. They were completely blind. Marco reached table 1 and sat without ceremony, without waiting for anyone to pull out his chair. The bodyguards took positions, one by the entrance, one with clear sightlines to the kitchen. The twins stood awkwardly by their chairs, uncertain. "Sit," Marco said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a resonance that made the crystal chandelier seem to shiver. "Matteo. Luca. Now." The boys fumbled for their chairs, hands patting the air, and Elena felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd buried 2 years ago when she'd lost her research position, when she'd lost everything. She recognized that movement, that specific spatial uncertainty. These boys weren't damaged, they were hypersensitive, and nobody in this room, including their father, had any idea what they were capable of. Elena's hands were steady as she approached table 1 with the water carafe, though her pulse hammered against her throat. Years of academic presentations had taught her to project calm, even when her world was collapsing. This was just another performance. "Good evening, Mr. De Luca," she said, her voice carefully neutral as she poured sparkling water into his glass. She didn't look him in the eye. Salvatore's warning echoed in her mind. Marco didn't respond. He was scanning the menu with the intensity of a man reviewing a hit list, his tattooed fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against the white tablecloth. Elena moved to the twins. Matteo, or was it Luca, had his hands hovering above the table setting, fingers trembling as they searched for the water glass. His brother sat rigidly, head tilted at that peculiar angle. Mouth slightly parted. Both boys were barely breathing, their small bodies coiled with tension. She poured their water carefully, noting how they both flinched at the sound of liquid hitting crystal, how their heads swiveled toward the noise with perfect precision. "Matteo!" Marco's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Your napkin. In your lap." The boy's hand swept across the table, knocking a fork to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to reverberate through the entire restaurant. Several diners turned to look. Marco's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his ear. "Christ! Luca, help your brother!" But Luca was frozen, overwhelmed, his breathing coming faster. A waiter passed behind their table, and both boys jerked violently, heads snapping toward the movement they couldn't see but could somehow sense. Elena's professional mask began to crack. She'd seen this before, sensory overload in her blind students, back when she still had students, back when her research mattered to anyone but her. "They need your order, gentlemen." Salvatore appeared at her elbow, his smile plastic and desperate. "Perhaps the ossobuco. It's exceptional tonight." "Just bring whatever," Marco muttered, his attention fixed on his sons with something that looked like shame dressed up as irritation. "And get them chicken. Plain. Nothing they can make a mess with." Matteo's hand was still searching for his napkin. His fingers found it, but in pulling it to his lap, he caught the edge of his water glass. Time seemed to slow as the crystal tipped. Water cascading across the white tablecloth in a spreading dark stain that reached the edge and began to drip onto Marco's perfectly pressed trousers. "God damn it!" Marco shoved back from the table, his chair scraping violently. The bodyguard by the kitchen took a step forward, hand moving inside his jacket. Matteo's face crumpled. Luca pressed his hands over his ears. Something inside Elena snapped. The same thing that had snapped 2 years ago when she'd watched the university board shut down her acoustics lab, the same fury she'd felt when they'd called her research impractical and her methods unconventional. She grabbed the empty serving tray from the nearby stand and, before she could talk herself out of it, let it fall. The silver tray hit the marble floor with a catastrophic crash that stopped every conversation in the restaurant. Both twins' heads whipped toward the sound with mechanical precision. Their hands shot out simultaneously, fingers pointing to the exact location where the tray had landed, 3 feet to their left, by the wine station, without hesitation, without groping in the dark. Marco froze, water still dripping from his pants, his eyes moving from his sons to Elena. She knelt between the twins, her voice low and clear. "They're not broken, Mr. De Luca." She looked up at him then, breaking Salvatore's cardinal rule, meeting those dangerous dark eyes without flinching. They see through sound. The restaurant held its breath. At this moment, what would you think if you were Marco? Marco stared at her, then at his sons, who were both now turned toward her voice with perfect orientation, their unseeing eyes somehow locked on exactly where she crouched. "What did you say?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an avalanche about to fall. Elena finished her shift in a daze, mechanically clearing tables and avoiding Salvatore's murderous glare. After the tray incident, Marco had simply stared at her for what felt like an eternity, then gestured to one of his bodyguards. They'd left without ordering, the twins walking between the 2 guards like small prisoners being escorted to cells. She'd expected to be fired. Instead, Salvatore had hissed that she was lucky to still have kneecaps and banished her to the kitchen for the rest of the night. Now, at midnight, Elena pushed through the employee exit into the alley behind Il Destino, pulling her thin jacket tight against the rain. The storm had softened to a steady drizzle, turning the narrow street into a river of reflected neon. She made it exactly 4 steps before the black SUV pulled up, blocking her path. The rear door opened. "Get in, Ms. Vance." The voice came from the darkness inside, smooth, accented, absolutely certain of being obeyed. Elena's stomach dropped. She recognized that voice from table 1. "I'm just trying to go home, Mr. De Luca. I didn't mean any disrespect. I said get in." Not louder, just colder. A second SUV pulled up behind her, cutting off her escape route. The bodyguard from the restaurant, the one who'd stood by the kitchen, emerged from the driver's seat. He was even larger up close, his expression suggesting that her compliance was optional, but her accompaniment was not. Elena climbed into the SUV. Marco sat in the back seat, still in his suit, though he'd changed the water-stained trousers. The interior smelled of leather and expensive cologne. A laptop was open on the seat beside him, its screen casting blue light across his sharp features. "Elena Vance," he said, not looking at her as the SUV pulled away from the curb. "Born in Portland, bachelor's in physics from MIT, master's and doctoral work in acoustic engineering at Columbia, specializing in human echolocation and spatial navigation for the visually impaired." He finally turned to face her. Published 17 papers, secured a $3 million grant, then nothing. 2 years ago, you disappeared from academia entirely. Now you're serving pasta to tourists." Elena's mouth went dry. What happened, Miss Vance? Why did a brilliant physicist become a waitress?" She stared out the window, watching her neighborhood slide past. They were heading toward the Upper East Side, away from her studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen. "That's none of your business. I'm making it my business." He closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "My sons. What you said about them. Explain." "I shouldn't have interfered. I apologize." "Don't apologize. Explain." Elena took a breath. "Echolocation. It's the ability to navigate using reflected sound. Bats do it. Dolphins do it. And some humans, particularly those born blind or who lose their sight early, can learn to do it with remarkable precision. Your sons aren't just blind, Mr. DeLuca. They're hypersensitive to auditory information. The way they tracked that tray, the way they react to movement they can't see but can hear, the air displacement, the subtle changes in ambient sound, they're already doing it instinctively." Marco was quiet for a long moment. The doctors were looking at their eyes. I'm talking about their brains." She turned to face him. "With training, truly dedicated training, your sons could navigate better in the dark than most people can in daylight." The SUV pulled up to a building Elena recognized, one of those pre-war fortresses on Fifth Avenue that cost more per month than she'd made in a year as a professor. But they weren't stopping. The vehicle turned into an underground garage. "Where are we going?" Elena demanded. "Home," Marco said simply. "Your apartment has been cleared. Your landlord has been paid through the end of the year, though you won't need it." "What? You can't just... Your student loans have been settled, all of them. The medical debt from your mother's final illness also cleared." He glanced at his phone. "And your cat, Schrödinger, according to your veterinarian records, is already at the estate with my housekeeper. She set him up in the East Wing. Apparently, he has opinions about furniture." Elena felt the world tilt. "You kidnapped my cat? I acquired your cat. Along with you?" Marco's expression didn't change. "Congratulations, Dr. Vance. You're now employed by the DeLuca family. You will live at my estate. You will train my sons. And you will not leave until I say you can leave." The SUV emerged from the garage and accelerated onto the FDR drive, heading north toward destinations unknown. "This is insane," Elena whispered. "This is necessary," Marco corrected. "You said they see through sound. Prove it." The DeLuca estate materialized from the darkness like something out of a Gothic nightmare. All stone and iron, perched on 20 acres in Westchester County, surrounded by walls that looked designed to keep out armies. Security cameras tracked their approach. Guards with earpieces nodded as the SUV passed through gates that closed behind them with the finality of a prison door. Elena had expected opulence. What she found was a mausoleum. The interior was all white marble and vaulted ceilings, the kind of space designed to impress rather than comfort. Every surface was hard, reflective. Their footsteps echoed with each step, multiplying into a cacophony of sound that would be torture for anyone with heightened hearing. "Jesus!" Elena muttered, wincing at how her voice bounced off the walls. "This place is an acoustic nightmare." Marco's expression darkened. "It was designed by someone who didn't have to live here with hypersensitive children." She turned in a slow circle, taking in the excessive empty space, the lack of sound-dampening materials. "Every noise in here multiplies. No wonder they were overwhelmed at the restaurant. They probably live in a constant state of sensory assault." A woman in her 60s appeared from a side hallway, wearing a cardigan and carrying a disgruntled orange tabby. "Mr. DeLuca, the boys are in the East Wing, and this creature," she held up Schrödinger, who looked thoroughly offended by his relocation. has already knocked over 3 vases. That's my cat, Elena said, reaching for him. Schrödinger immediately began purring, the little traitor. Where are Matteo and Luca? Their playroom. The woman, Mrs. Castellano, according to Marco's introduction, gestured toward a grand staircase. 3rd door on the left. They've been in there since this afternoon. Elena didn't wait for permission. She climbed the stairs, Marco's footsteps close behind her, and found the room Mrs. Castellano had described. It was obscene. Thousands of square feet filled with every expensive toy imaginable. A train set that probably cost more than a car. Stuffed animals arranged in militant rows, building blocks still in their designer packaging. Everything was pristine, untouched, organized with the precision of a museum display. And in the center of this shrine to childhood, sitting on the floor with their backs against each other, were the twins. They weren't playing. They were simply existing. 2 small figures in an ocean of things they couldn't see and apparently didn't want. How long do they sit like this? Elena asked quietly. Marco's jaw tightened. Hours. The therapist said they needed stimulation. I bought them stimulation. They don't need more things, Mr. De Luca. They need connection. Elena set Schrödinger down and stepped into the room. Both boys' heads immediately turned toward the sound of her footsteps, tracking her movement with uncanny precision. She knelt in front of them. Matteo, Luca, my name is Elena. I'm going to teach you something your father's doctors don't know. Neither boy responded, but she could see the subtle tension in their shoulders, the way they were listening with every fiber of their being. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through her music library. She found what she was looking for, a hip-hop track with a heavy, rhythmic bass line, and turned the volume up. The beat pulsed through the room, and both twins flinched. Stay with it, Elena said softly. She grabbed a red balloon from the pile of unused toys and inflated it, then placed it against Matteo's chest. Feel that? The boy's hands came up slowly, touching the balloon, and his eyes widened as the bass from the music made the rubber vibrate against his skin. Elena moved the balloon in rhythm with the beat, up, down, side to side, keeping time with the music. Matteo's head began to bob, almost imperceptibly at first, then with more confidence. She handed the balloon to Luca, who clutched it like a lifeline, his whole body beginning to sway. For the first time since Elena had seen them, both boys were smiling. "What are you doing?" Marco's voice was hoarse. "Giving them a language," Elena said, watching as the twins began to bounce the balloon between them, perfectly synchronized with the music they were feeling rather than hearing. Teaching them that sound isn't something to fear. It's something they can dance with. Matteo laughed, a small, surprised sound, and the entire room seemed to shift on its axis. Marco watched from the doorway as his sons, his silent, unreachable sons, bounced a balloon between them with something that looked dangerously close to joy. The music was too loud, some urban track with profanity he'd normally never allow near children, but neither twin seemed to care. They were moving, swaying, their small hands finding the balloon in midair with impossible accuracy. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the bass. "It's past their bedtime." The music stopped. Elena had paused it without looking away from the boys, who had both frozen mid-reach, their faces falling back into that careful blankness that Marco knew too well. "Actually," Elena said, her tone polite but inflexible, "we're in the middle of a breakthrough. Your sons are learning to associate sound with pleasure instead of pain. Stopping now would undo an hour of progress." Marco felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially not in his own home by a woman he'd employed less than 3 hours ago. "Dr. Vance, come here," she interrupted, and had the audacity to pat the floor beside her. "Sit down, Mr. DeLuca." "Excuse me? You heard me. Sit or leave and let me work, but don't hover in the doorway like some kind of disapproving ghost. You're making them nervous." Marco glanced at the twins. Both boys had turned their faces toward him, their blind eyes somehow finding his location with unnerving precision. Their shoulders were tense again, their hands clasped in their laps. They looked like they were waiting for punishment. Something in his chest twisted. He walked into the room, this ridiculous, expensive room full of toys his sons had never wanted, and lowered himself to the floor beside Elena. The position felt absurd. The Capo dei Capi sitting cross-legged on a carpet that cost $30,000, his suit probably creasing in ways his tailor would weep over. "Good," Elena said, as if he were a student who'd finally followed instructions. She restarted the music, that same pulsing rhythm, and pressed the balloon into his hands. "Hold this against your chest, just like they did." Marco held the balloon awkwardly. The bass from the music made it vibrate against his ribs, a strange, almost intimate sensation. He felt ridiculous. Elena guided Matteo's hand to the balloon, placing the boy's small palm against the rubber surface. The vibrations traveled from Marco's chest through the balloon to his son's hand, a physical connection, a bridge of sensation where words had always failed. Matteo's face transformed. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, and then, slowly, tentatively, he smiled. Not the polite, empty smile Marco had seen in photographs, but something real. "Papa!" The word was barely a whisper. Marco's throat closed. "I'm here, Matteo. He can feel your heartbeat through the vibration," Elena explained softly. "To him, you're not just a voice anymore. You're a presence he can map, understand, connect with." She guided Luca's hand to the balloon as well, so both twins were touching it, feeling the music, feeling their father. This is how they experience the world, Mr. DeLuca. Through sound, through vibration, through patterns you and I take for granted. The three of them sat there, Marco rigid and uncomfortable, the twins relaxed and present in a way he'd never seen, as the music played. Luca started humming, off-key but earnest, his hand still pressed to the balloon. Matteo's fingers tapped against the rubber in rhythm. Marco realized he was crying. Not obviously. Not the kind of breakdown that would compromise his reputation, but tears were sliding down his face, nonetheless. 6 years. 6 years of specialists and therapies and desperate prayers to a God he didn't believe in, and a waitress with a cat named after a quantum physics joke had achieved more in one evening than any of them. If you were Marco, would this moment change you forever? "Fix it," he said, his voice rough. "Whatever you need, money, equipment, time, fix the bridge between us. I'm giving you full authority over their education, their schedule, everything. Just..." He looked at his sons, who were both smiling now, both swaying to music they couldn't hear but could feel. "Just help me reach them." Elena met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd forced her into that SUV, she looked at him without fear. "I can't promise to fix anything, Mr. DeLuca, but I can teach you all how to meet in the middle." Elena woke to the sound of shouting, muffled, urgent voices carrying through the marble halls of the estate. She checked her phone. 3:17 a.m. Schrödinger was already at the door, tail twitching with agitation. She pulled on jeans and a sweater and followed the commotion downstairs, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. The voices led her to the kitchen, where she found Marco sprawled in a chair, his white shirt soaked crimson on the left side, while Mrs. Castellano pressed dish towels against his ribs with shaking hands. "Jesus Christ," Elena breathed. Marco's head snapped toward her voice, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "Get her out of here." "She stays," Mrs. Castellano said firmly. "I can't do this alone, and you've forbidden us from calling Dr. Marchetti. Because Marchetti talks, and if word gets out that someone got close enough to—" Marco hissed in pain as Mrs. Castellano pressed harder. "Fuck." Elena moved on instinct, the same clarity that had carried her through lab emergencies taking over. "How bad is it?" "Through and through," one of the bodyguards said from the doorway. He was the one from the restaurant, his suit jacket missing, blood on his hands. "Small caliber. Missed anything vital, but he's losing blood. Kitchen table, now." Elena was already washing her hands in the sink, her mind cataloguing what she'd need. "Mrs. Castellano, I need clean towels, your sewing kit, vodka, the highest proof you have, and superglue if there's any in the house." "Superglue?" Marco's voice was strained. "Medical adhesive is just expensive superglue. We'll make do." Elena dried her hands and turned to face him. "Can you walk?" Marco stood, swaying slightly, and let the bodyguard help him to the massive kitchen table. He sat on the edge, then lay back with a grunt of pain. His shirt was ruined, the fabric sticking to the wound. Elena cut it away with kitchen shears, revealing a neat hole just below his ribs on the left side, still bleeding steadily. The exit wound on his back was worse, ragged, angry. "You're lucky. Another 2 inches right and we'd be talking about a collapsed lung." "I feel very lucky," Marco said through gritted teeth. Mrs. Castellano returned with supplies. Elena soaked towels in vodka and began cleaning the wound, ignoring Marco's sharp intake of breath. The bullet had indeed gone straight through, missing major organs but tearing through muscle. It needed proper surgical attention, but she understood why that wasn't an option. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading a needle with black thread from Mrs. Castellano's sewing kit. "Just do it." Elena worked quickly, her hands steady, despite never having done this outside of a single wilderness first aid course years ago. The exit wound required careful attention, pulling the ragged edges together as neatly as possible. Marco's jaw was clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding, but he didn't make a sound. "Who did this?" she asked, trying to distract him. "The Rossi family. They're making moves, testing boundaries." Marco's voice was tight with pain. "They followed me from a meeting in Brooklyn, got off one shot before my guys returned fire. Why would they risk that?" "You're not exactly an easy target." Marco was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because they think I'm weak now. Because of the boys." Elena's hands paused. "What?" "In my world, everything is leverage. Everything is a potential weakness to exploit." His dark eyes found hers. "I have 2 sons who can't see danger coming, can't defend themselves, can't even walk through a room without assistance. The other families look at that and see opportunity. They see a boss who's distracted, vulnerable, compromised. So you hide them." "I protect them," Marco corrected sharply. "But yes, I keep them away from the business, away from public view. Because the moment my enemies understand how much they mean to me..." He trailed off, his expression bleak. "The Rossis aren't the only ones watching. They're just the first ones bold enough to act." Elena tied off the final suture and applied the superglue to seal the edges, then bandaged the wound with clean towels. "Your sons aren't your weakness, Mr. De Luca. They're the only real thing in your life." "That's exactly why they're a weakness," Marco said, and closed his eyes. The next morning, arrived with the brittle tension of a wire pulled too tight. Marco had disappeared into his study at dawn, despite Elena's protests about rest and infection. Mrs. Castellano moved through the house with the stiff efficiency of someone preparing for war, and the bodyguards had multiplied. Elena counted at least 6 new faces patrolling the grounds. She found the twins in their playroom, sitting in their usual back-to-back position. But something was different. Their heads were tilted toward the hallway, tracking footsteps she could barely hear. "Good morning, Matteo. Luca." Elena kept her voice gentle, settling onto the floor beside them. "Ready to learn something new?" Matteo reached toward her voice, his small hand finding her arm with surprising accuracy. "Papa is hurt." Elena stilled. "How did you—" "We heard him," Luca said quietly. His blind eyes were aimed at the floor, but his expression was fierce. In the night, he was breathing wrong, scared breathing. These boys heard everything. Of course they did. "Your father is fine," Elena assured them, though the memory of all that blood made her stomach turn. "He's tougher than he looks." She was setting up the morning's lesson, teaching them to identify objects by the sound they made when dropped, when Marco's head of security, a granite-faced man named Luca Santoro, appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Vance, the boss wants you in his study, now." The study was all dark wood and leather, the kind of room designed for intimidation. Marco sat behind an enormous desk, his face grey with pain, despite the fresh bandages Elena could see beneath his black shirt. 3 other men stood around the room, Santoro, another bodyguard, and a thin man in glasses who looked like an accountant. "The attack last night wasn't opportunistic," Marco said without preamble. "They knew my route. They knew I'd be alone, except for one guard. They knew the exact time I'd be passing that intersection." Elena's mouth went dry. "How?" "Someone told them." Marco's voice was flat, controlled, but his hands were clenched on the desk. "Someone in this house. Someone with access to my schedule." "Sir," the thin man, apparently the head of household operations, spoke up nervously. "I've reviewed everyone who knew your movements yesterday. It's a short list. Mrs. Castellano, myself, Santoro, and the detail assigned to your vehicle. All people I've trusted for years," Marco said, "which means either my judgment is catastrophically flawed or someone's been compromised." Santoro cleared his throat. "There's another possibility. The new hire." Every eye in the room turned to Elena. "She arrives, and within 24 hours you're shot," Santoro continued, his tone reasonable and damning. "She has access to the house, to your sons, to your private schedule." She could easily have contacted the Rossis. Elena felt ice slide down her spine. "I was kidnapped into this job. I didn't even know where we were going until we arrived." "Or that's what you wanted us to think." Santoro took a step toward her. "You were researching acoustic weapons at Columbia before you disappeared. Maybe the Rossis recruited you. Maybe this whole echolocation angle is a way to get close." "Enough!" Marco's voice cracked like a whip. He stood, wincing at the movement, and walked around the desk to face Elena directly. "If Dr. Vance wanted me dead, she had the perfect opportunity last night. I was bleeding on a kitchen table, and she had scissors in her hand." He held her gaze. "She could have cut my throat. She didn't." "That doesn't mean— It means she's not the leak." Marco turned to Santoro. "But you're right that someone is. I want full surveillance on all household staff. Check their communications, their bank accounts, their family connections. Whoever sold me out, I want them found." The men filed out, Santoro last, giving Elena a look that suggested this conversation wasn't over. Marco sank back into his chair once they were alone. "He's not wrong to suspect you. But you don't. No. He studied her face. The twins trust you. They don't trust anyone. That's recommendation enough. Elena's hands were shaking. If there's really a traitor here, your sons are in danger. I know. Marco's expression was bleak, which is why you're going to teach them faster. Whatever you've been planning, acceleration, self-defense through sound, all of it. We're out of time. 3 days of intensive training had transformed the twins. They could now navigate the East Wing without assistance, identify people by their footsteps, and detect changes in a room's acoustics that Elena herself couldn't perceive. But they were still children, still confined to the estate's increasingly claustrophobic walls, and Marco had made an executive decision. "We're going out," he announced at breakfast, his wound clearly still bothering him, despite his attempts to hide it. "The Bronx Botanical Garden. I've rented it for the afternoon." Elena set down her coffee. "Is that wise? After the leak, I can't keep them in a fortress forever?" Marco's jaw was set. They need to experience the world, not just hear about it from inside these walls. Besides, the garden will be empty except for my security team. Santoro's already swept the location, which was how Elena found herself 2 hours later, walking through the conservatory with Matteo's hand in hers, while Luca held Marco's. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of orchids, and the twins were overwhelmed in the best possible way, their faces turned upward, mouths slightly open, drinking in every echo, every rustle of leaves. "There's water," Matteo said suddenly, tugging Elena toward the sound of a fountain. "Moving water. It sounds like..." He paused, searching for words. "Like glass breaking, but soft." "Exactly right," Elena smiled. They'd been working on metaphor, on giving language to what the twins perceived. "Can you tell how far away it is?" Both boys tilted their heads, perfectly synchronized. 20 steps, Luca said, confidently. It was actually 18, but Elena wasn't about to discourage that kind of precision. They moved through the conservatory, Marco's security detail maintaining a discreet perimeter. Elena could see at least 4 guards, though she suspected there were more she couldn't spot. Marco himself seemed more relaxed than she'd seen him, watching his sons explore with something approaching wonder. "Papa," Luca called out, "can we go outside, to the glass building we passed?" The Hauptconservatory's exterior offered spectacular views through its Victorian-style glass panels. Marco nodded, and they made their way out, the twins navigating the steps with growing confidence. Elena was explaining how the glass panels would create different acoustic reflections when Matteo suddenly went rigid. "Something's wrong," he whispered. Elena knelt beside him. "What do you hear?" "Not here. See." His hand shot out, pointing toward a glass panel on the building across from them. "There. Light wrong. Too bright. Like..." He struggled for the comparison. "Like when you shine Papa's watch at the wall." Elena's blood turned to ice. A reflection. Sharp, focused. The kind of reflection that comes from... "Sniper!" She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She grabbed both twins and threw herself sideways just as the glass panel behind them exploded. The crack of the rifle shot came a second later, echoing across the garden. Marco was already moving, his body covering his sons, even as Elena rolled them behind a stone planter. More shots, 3, 4, splitting the air where they'd been standing. "Stay down!" Marco's voice was steel. His hand had somehow produced a gun from beneath his jacket. "Santoro! Northeast rooftop!" The security team erupted into action. Return fire cracked from multiple positions. Elena pressed the twins against the planter, her body shielding them, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Luca spotted him. Matteo said into her shoulder, his voice shaking but clear. He saw the reflection. He saved us. Elena looked at the boy, this 6-year-old child who'd just identified a sniper's scope, by the way, light bent through glass, and felt something shift in her understanding of what these children could become. Marco was shouting orders, his men moving with practiced efficiency toward the source of the gunfire. The shots had stopped. Either the sniper was dead, or he'd fled. "Clear!" Santoro's voice came through Marco's earpiece. "Target down. 2 hostiles, both eliminated. Sir, we need to move you now." Marco grabbed Elena's arm, hauling her and the twins toward the waiting SUVs. "The garden was swept. I had 8 men check it this morning." His voice was raw with fury and something that might have been fear. "Someone told them we'd be here. Someone in my inner circle is trying to kill my family." Luca was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. But his hand was still pointing toward where the sniper had been, his blind eyes somehow tracking the threat even after it was gone. "He saw it," Elena said to Marco as they reached the vehicles. "Your son saw the danger coming before any of us." Marco looked at Luca, then at Matteo, who had his arms wrapped protectively around his brother. "Then we teach them to see everything," he said quietly, "because next time, I might not have 8 armed guards. Next time, they might only have each other." They didn't make it back to the estate. The SUV was 3 blocks from the botanical garden when Marco's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Eleanor watched his face turn to stone. "Stop the car," he said quietly. Santoro, driving, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir, we need to get you to—" I said, "Stop the fucking car." The SUV pulled to the curb. Marco stared at his phone for a long moment, then handed it to Eleanor. The text was from a contact labeled simply V. "They're alive? God damn it, Marco. You were supposed to be alone. This complicates things." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Who's V?" "Vinny Basciano, my cousin." Marco's voice was completely flat. "My head of operations for the New Jersey ports. I've known him since we were kids." He looked at Santoro. "How long?" Santoro's face had gone pale. "Boss, I swear I didn't know. How long has Vinny had access to my schedule?" 2 years. "Since you promoted him." Santoro's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He coordinates your movements with the port operations. I never thought—" "Family doesn't." "Family does," Marco said bitterly. "When there's enough money involved, family always does." Another text came through. This one was an address in the Bronx, an industrial area near the waterfront. "Come alone, or I start sending pieces of Mrs. Castellano to your house. You have 20 minutes. "He has Mrs. Castellano," Elena breathed. Marco was already moving, checking his weapon, his face a mask of cold fury. "Santoro, take Dr. Vance and the boys to the safe house in Connecticut. Don't stop. Don't call anyone. If you don't hear from me in 3 hours, contact my lawyer." "Papa, no." Matteo's voice was small but firm. "Don't go alone." "I have to, Figlio. It's the only way to keep you safe." "Then we come too," Luca said. Both twins had their faces turned toward their father with uncanny accuracy. "We can help." Marco's expression softened for just a moment. "You've already saved us once today. That's enough heroism for 2 6-year-olds. He kissed both their foreheads, then looked at Eleanor. "Keep them alive. Whatever happens to me, keep them alive." "Marco." But he was already out of the SUV, commandeering another vehicle from the security convoy. Eleanor watched him drive away, her heart in her throat. The warehouse was exactly what Marco expected, abandoned, isolated, perfect for an execution. Vinny was waiting inside, backlit by the late afternoon sun streaming through broken windows. Mrs. Castellano sat bound to a chair, her mouth gagged, her eyes wide with fear. "Cugino," Vinny said, his voice carrying an edge of regret. "I wish it hadn't come to this." Marco kept his hands visible, his weapon holstered. "How much are the Rossis paying you?" "5 million, plus control of the Newark operation." Vinny shrugged. "You understand business, Marco. Nothing personal." "You're right, it's not personal." Marco took a step forward. "It's family, which makes it worse." "Those blind kids made you soft," Vinny said, raising his gun. The old Marco would have seen this coming months ago. "But you've been too busy playing father to broken toys." The insult died in his throat as Marco moved, not toward Vinny, but toward Mrs. Castellano, using her chair as cover as he rolled behind a concrete pillar. Vinny fired, 3 quick shots that echoed deafeningly in the empty space. "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding," Marco called back. "I'm listening." He could hear everything now, the way Elena had taught him to listen when they'd practiced with the twins. Vinny's footsteps, heavy and careless, his breathing, rapid and nervous, the distinctive click of him checking his magazine. Marco waited. Vinny moved closer, his footsteps giving away his position. When he was exactly 3 meters away, Marco stepped out and fired twice. Vinny's gun clicked uselessly, a jam, the kind that happens when you maintain your weapons poorly and fire too quickly. He looked down at the spreading red on his chest, then back at Marco. "You're loud, Vinny," Marco said quietly, walking forward. "You always were. Loud footsteps, loud mouth, loud gun. In our world, the loud ones die first." He stood over his cousin as Vinny collapsed. "You should have learned silence." He cut Mrs. Castellano free, then pulled out his phone to call Santoro. His hand was shaking. Not from fear. From the realization that if his sons hadn't learned to hear danger coming, if Elena hadn't taught them to translate sound into survival, none of them would have made it out of that garden alive. Family had betrayed him, but his family, his real family, had saved him. The Connecticut safe house was a modest colonial, nothing like the marble fortress they'd left behind. When Marco walked through the door 3 hours after leaving them, Elena nearly collapsed with relief. The twins heard him first, his distinctive footstep pattern, and ran to him with a confidence they'd never had before. "You came back," Matteo said, his small arms wrapped around Marco's waist. "Always," Marco promised, holding both boys close. Over their heads, his eyes found Elena's. "It's over. Vinny's dead. The leak is sealed." But it wasn't over. Not really. It was just beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood in the wings of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, watching the crowd assemble. Every major family in the New York underworld was represented, along with legitimate business partners, politicians and socialites who pretended not to know how Marco De Luca had made his fortune. This was the annual De Luca Foundation Gala, the event where deals were made and power was displayed. This year, Marco was making a very different kind of statement. "You're sure about this?" Elena asked him quietly. He stood beside her in a tuxedo, looking every inch the dangerous man he was. But his attention was fixed on the stage where a Steinway grand piano sat under a single spotlight. "I've never been more sure of anything." Marco straightened his cuffs. "They need to see what my sons are, not what they assumed they were." The twins appeared from the dressing room, led by Mrs. Castellano. They wore matching tuxedos, their hair styled identically, but the real transformation was in how they moved. No hesitation, no uncertainty. They navigated through the backstage chaos with fluid grace, their heads tracking every sound, every movement. "Ready, boys?" Elena asked. "Ready," they answered in unison. The lights dimmed. Marco walked onto the stage, and the room fell silent. That particular silence that comes when predators recognize an apex among them. "Thank you all for coming," Marco said, his voice carrying easily through the space. 6 months ago, someone tried to kill me and my family. They failed, obviously. A ripple of careful laughter. They failed because they made the same mistake many of you have made. They assumed my sons were my weakness. He paused. "Tonight I'm going to show you why that assumption is fatal." He gestured to the wings. Eleanor guided the twins onto the stage, and she heard the intake of breath from the audience as they registered the boys' blind eyes, their careful but confident steps. Matteo and Luca took their positions at the piano, an instrument Elena had spent months teaching them, using the same principles of vibration and sound that had started with a balloon and hip-hop music. What happened next silenced the room more effectively than any threat Marco could have made. The twins began to play. Not a simple melody, but Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, a percussion-heavy, rhythmically complex piece that most sighted pianists struggled with. Their hands moved in perfect synchronization, each boy handling different registers, their entire bodies swaying with the music they felt through the piano's vibrations. They played for 8 minutes. 8 minutes of aggressive, beautiful, impossibly precise music that spoke of power and control, and an understanding of sound that transcended normal human perception. When they finished, the silence stretched for 3 full seconds before the applause began. Tentative at first, then building to something that sounded like awe. Marco returned to the stage, placing a hand on each son's shoulder. "My sons see what you cannot. They hear what you miss. They are the future of this family." He looked directly at certain faces in the crowd, rivals, potential threats, the ambitious and the hungry. And they are untouchable. Backstage, after the endless handshakes and careful congratulations, Marco found Elena in the quiet hallway. The twins were with Mrs. Castellano, still buzzing with adrenaline. "You did this," Marco said. "You gave them back to me." "I just taught them to listen," Elena replied. "They did the rest." "No." Marco stepped closer, his hand finding hers. "You taught all of us to listen, to really hear what matters." He glanced toward where his sons were laughing with Mrs. Castellano, the sound bright and unguarded. "I spent 6 years trying to fix them. You spent 6 months showing me they were never broken." Elena squeezed his hand. "They're not the only ones who learned something." Marco smiled, a real smile, rare and transformative. "No, they're not." In the ballroom, the party continued. Deals were made, alliances shifted, power changed hands with handshakes and subtle nods. But in that quiet hallway, the real victory was already won. A family that had been fractured by shame and fear and silence, now whole in ways that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with truly seeing each other. The twins appeared then, Matteo holding Luca's hand, both of them navigating the hallway with the unconscious grace of children who had conquered their world. "Papa," Luca said. "Can we do it again?" "The performance?" Marco asked. "No." Matteo grinned. "Everything. Can we do everything again? All of it?" Marco knelt, bringing himself to their level, and pulled both boys into his arms. "Every day," he promised. "We'll do it all every day." And for the first time in 6 years, Marco De Luca believed in his own promise.